Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's pretty early Thursday morning, so hopefully everybody had enough time to get their questions in, but let's jump in and see what we got. First up, over on the YouTube support service, Boss7Aim wants to know if there's a possibility to see a Mr. Pi with a power button like Retro Castles. And yeah, actually, Ivory from Retro Castle has been trying to get both a Taki board as well as a QM Tech board and has been having trouble. So hopefully he'll be able to get both of those in so that he could make his kits for those. Because I agree, I would love to see the same thing. That small, compact, really awesome kit. It's definitely my favorite, but I'd love to see it work with the cheaper DE10 Nano alternatives, including having the power button, which I think is one of the best features of that board. So hopefully we could figure out how to get Ivory a couple of these things just to make his models and start selling them. But I don't know of anybody else doing it with a power button. So we'll see. And you know what? I do these off the cuff. So it could have been something that I already talked about in a weekly roundup that I'm completely forgetting. So my apologies if there is a case out there. Let me know in the comments, of course. And just a polite reminder, YouTube blocks all links. So you have to type out like Mr. Case Vendor XYZ and don't actually just drop a web link. But hopefully we'll have Retro Castle cases soon. Now, moving on to Floatplane, Shorjor wants to know, regarding his Extron Crosspoint, does it introduce any lag when it comes to Lightguns? Would routing the signal out to a Core U and back to the Crosspoint and then to the CRT still work? Maybe also a comp to RGB. They're trying to optimize their cables and having more quality signals running all around. And they haven't RGB modded any of their consoles yet, so routing them through the transcoders would give them the ability to have cables go into the CRT and scalers and have that only be RGB or component. So I've never tried multiple. If you were asking if running it through a crosspoint adds lag, no, that's absolutely zero. But I have also tested things like the RGB to S-video and composite converter, and that was zero latency as well. Lightguns worked totally fine, and I believe it's because it's using the same style chips that are used inside consoles, so it's an instantaneous conversion of these things. But if you're talking about putting it through all of that as well as a transcoder like the comp to RGB, so like let's say you go to the Core U, then to the comp to RGB, then to the Crosspoint, then to your CRT, I think you'll be fine. I'm pretty sure that's still a total latency of 0, but I've never done 2 transcoders in the same chain to test it. So my gut's telling me you should be fine. However, this is something you're going to want to benchtop test before you take the time to buy cables and do this entire setup. But it should be fine because these are all instantaneous analog conversions. There's no digital processing or buffering going on, so it should be totally fine. But I'd be curious to know the answer. So if you have a moment to benchtop it, please let us know. Now moving over to Patreon, Andre Coelho wanted to chime in about the question from Captain Retro and said, the answer to your question is pretty much what Bob suggested. If you buy a twin Famicom RGB mod kit from Mod in France, for instance, you'll notice that it has a little PCB that goes off to the side and taps into the sound from the RCA jacks. They use their kit to mod theirs, keeping the original DIN port, because theirs had all of the pins and they could reuse their Neo Geo RGB cable with it. It works fine. They get picture and audio with no discernible interference. So thank you so much for confirming, Andre. I appreciate that. And Captain Retro, looks like my guess was correct, but it is cool that somebody else was able to verify that. So let us know what happens. Dustin Mattson was just following up from the conversation last week about running long wires and using a wireless mic for a stand-up comedy thing. And Dustin mentioned that this setup that they're using has RCA ports on the back of it, so they'd be able to pull audio directly from that in order to use in post-processing for a video. And the only thing I will add to that is test it first, because I've done that with live music gigs as well. And I used to have friends with, their cell phones in the crowd, all from different places. And I would pull audio from the soundboard, and it was very common to get a hum or an interference or just a low quality signal. And there were a couple live gigs that we did. We played The Trooper at one of the casinos in Connecticut, which was pretty cool. I love that song. It was neat to be playing it. So I took audio from everybody that was there that I knew and blended that all together along with the soundboard, because the soundboard recording was extra flat. So everybody together, it kind of created that ambiance and, the extra echo, and I filtered it a little bit and it came out way better. So, if you're talking about a super pro rig, all I'm saying is total waste of your time. But if you're talking about do-it-yourself stuff like I always did, that might be a great tip, is keep it from the soundboard. process it in post, but also set up even just cell phones, especially the newer ones are really great for audio and video, and set them up in different spots to add, even if you only blend like 3 or 4% of it in. The only other thing to add, shocker here, sound travels much slower than light. And everybody listening is like, yeah, no shit, except there were a couple of times where I had friends off to the side at gigs that got very cool angles from the back of the room with their camera. But the first time the first time I did this in a kind of bigger, more high profile gig, I saw the video that was off to the side first. So my friends, they sent me the videos, brought a USB stick, whatever. The next morning, I fired up the first video and went, "We're horrible. We are the worst band in the world. I can't believe this." And I was all bummed out. And then I started to flip through the audio that was directly centered from the video camera, and it was perfect. That's when I realized the audio from the left side of the stage traveled all the way around and then hit the camera at a different speed at a different time than the audio that was right in front. And that's why it sounded so bad. So it would be a little different if you only have one person talking with a stand-up comedy routine. But if you're trying to get crowd noise, clapping, and have everything sync up, and it's a do-it-yourself ghetto solution like mine always were, have a couple of different phones or cameras or whatever at different angles, both to get good shots, but also so the audio blends properly when you're done and you could filter out some of that. So I'll stop rambling about this stuff, but you're bringing back memories of all the crazy recording things I used to do for live gigs, and hopefully all the pain and suffering that I've gone through over the years could skip to the end and save you some heartaches for when you're doing your recordings. Next up, Quantum Guitar has been loving the digital audio mod for the SNES. They have an audio-focused surround setup that they also use for gaming, so the resulting clarity from the noise floor lowering, separation increasing, and filtering being removed really has impressed them. They found it odd that the mod has been so undersold generally. Not by me, but I see your point. Anyway, their preference is still using an analog display, so in lieu of full HDMI mods, what other digital audio mods have been on the market? The optical audio output from the PS2 has been a real luxury for PS1 and 2 titles with 480i on a PVM. So a bunch of consoles have them, I think really starting from the SNES up. I can't remember any previous consoles that have digital audio mods, certainly not NES, Genesis, or anything like that. But things like the 3DO, the Saturn, they all have digital mods available for them. And whether it changes the audio or not is always a question, and whether you interpret that as a good thing is also sometimes preference, sometimes there's an actual technical answer to it. And sometimes by going to these things, you do remove any of the analog filtering, which could be a good thing or bad thing, all depending on your setup, your speakers, etc., your ears. So I would just kind of go through and see if anybody's selling kits for any consoles that you own from SNES on, because while they're available, some of them are open source. You would have to breadboard a chip by yourself or make your own project. But the other thing that you could always do is check for things like Mister if those things are available to you. And that way you could kind of see, is this a big deal? Is there going to be a huge audio difference? And I think when it comes to audio like this, it really depends on your speakers and amp and your ears. So, and if you like the console or not. If you play me a video game that I've never played before on a console that I've rarely had any experience with, and you have this amazing digital audio mod for it, I'm not going to really tell that much of a difference because I don't have any experience with it. But you do specifically mention N64, and I don't know of any just dedicated digital audio mods for it. I would love to know if anybody has any information on it, just out of curiosity. But you could obviously just do an HDMI mod, and you even said an HDMI mod into an audio extractor for optical does feel kind of clunky for their needs, though effective. You said it really elegantly right there. Yeah, that's, the perfect description. If you were also streaming via HDMI, or you also had an OLED that you're connecting this thing to, then I would say definitely do an HDMI mod and just deal with the audio extraction. But I certainly wouldn't tell anybody to HDMI mod their N64 just for digital audio. But that's really going to be something that you have to decide for yourself. You mentioned that yours is RGB modded, but maybe that's something where, unless this is sentimental to you, you could sell your pre-modded N64 and put that towards a pre-modded HDMI N64 and kind of do that. But I'd love to hear other people's opinions. And I'm wondering, I bet your Console Mods probably has a list of digital audio mods available for consoles. And if not, that's something we could definitely work on. But it's it would have to be a little bit more detailed. Well, no, to start, we could just do a list of digital mods, but it would be nice to also have some sort of information on if there's any positive or negatives with that. Do you lose any functionality? Do you gain any? Is there filtering differences? Do you lose some of the sound chips because the digital audio is mixed before the full audio scenario, like with the SNES? So we would have to have a more detailed list. But yeah, for now, I would just kind of see what boards are available to sell and see if they're for any consoles that you like. And once again, you could always use something like the Mister to try and get perfectly clean audio, because a lot of the Mister kits have just an optical audio output as well. That's actually how I used it in my old New York City apartment, is I would roll a CRT over in front of the couch, plug in analog video, and then put the digital optical audio into my stereo. So it's kind of exactly like what your setup is. So that's always an option. I mean, I obviously appreciate real hardware, and that's something that's important to me, but this is one of those things where you should also just consider total cost, right? Like if you're really doing this for a handful of games, it would be cheaper to buy a Mister for that than to optical mod all of your original consoles. But if you want this for everything, then yeah, absolutely go through the trouble. Like for me, for Super Nintendo, that was really important to me, and I absolutely heard it and appreciated the difference. So yeah, hopefully I was able to point you somewhat in the right direction, but I am a fan of those mods. Next up, Tom M. had previously asked if there was any way for monthly supporters to get ad-free versions of the podcasts in their podcast feeds, and it appears that Patreon has a feature where you could turn on private RSS feeds. So Tom wanted to know if that was a lot of work for me or if it was something I'd be interested in doing. And there's two reasons why I am not interested in doing that. First and foremost, by far the biggest thing is that I want all people who support to be treated exactly equally. And I have, I think, accomplished that so far, so that nobody on, let's say, Patreon subs don't feel more important than float plane subs or anything like that. I want to make absolutely sure that all of you amazing people are treated equally. So I don't want to turn on a feature on one than another. However, I might not even actually be able to, because Patreon makes creators choose what tier they want to be in. And I'm still grandfathered in for the original one, but if I want any new feature, I have to bump up to the version that takes 3 times the cut that they take now. So anything added other than what I have could put me into that category. And I actually got, I hate to bite the hand that feeds here. Maybe I'm not going to be around next month because I'll be kicked out of Patreon for saying this, but I got kicked out of their ambassador program because I wasn't testing any of the new features, both because I would have to lose a lot of money to do so, but also because a lot of their new features are terrible. And I've absolutely, like, the other creators I talked to are like, who is this for? This isn't for us. So that was weird. But also was the only person asking hard questions in those meetings. So it was made known to me politely, pretty clearly, that they didn't want to hear what I was saying, and then I wasn't invited back again. So any Patreon focused features, I don't think I'm going to have the ability to do, both because I literally cannot afford to lose 3 times the amount that I'm already giving to Patreon, but also because I don't want to have to worry about one service gets better treatment than the other and stuff like that. So, it's maybe I'll be a wimp and go back and delete this before the podcast airs, because I think a big reason why more Patreon creators don't speak up is they're afraid of getting kicked out, like Patreon has done quite a lot of times in the past, and there's nothing you could do about that. So I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have said anything at all. As far as my creator to subscriber interaction with Patreon goes, I have zero complaints in that. All of you were amazing. It's cool that I don't get messages reliably, but I still go in and check the messages at least once a week. And so far, it's just been a great way to interact with people. And I wish the other services had direct messages and stuff too. But if nothing else, when people, as you see today, if you participate in the weekly Q&As, you could always ask stuff there. So I don't have any, I don't have any problem at all with our interaction with Patreon, but they've always been frustrating since day one. I think even when I was doing the giveaways, I was very vocal about not being treated very well through that process. So I don't know. Fingers crossed that things change, but bigger fingers crossed that they don't throw me out of their program for even speaking up about this at all, because that's the last thing I need. Next up, A recently refurbished a PAL SNES 2 chip, and they were looking for cable recommendations. They live in the US, but their TV is compatible with 50 hertz. So I would say, without any hesitation whatsoever, the cable you should get is either the HD Retrovision cable or the Retro Gaming Cable's Universal cable, because both of those are properly built to work with all regions of the SNES, which is really important because PAL SNES consoles put out voltage on the C-Sync pin, whereas NTSC ones put out C-Sync. So if you used the wrong cable and you switched it between, you could definitely destroy whatever device you plug it into. But that's never a worry with HD Retrovision, and that isn't a worry with the Universal cable, which I'll link to both of those things. So this is also one of those scenarios where you get what you pay for. You buy a $2 AliExpress cable, you're not going to get the right components in it. Maybe it's going to work right. Maybe it's dangerous. Maybe it'll work, but it'll just be crap. But either of those choices are very good, and it's what I would strongly recommend for your scenario. Because even if you decide you only want to keep your PAL SNES, what if you use it with an NTSC N64? Or what if you're just trying to eventually get like an AV Famicom or something like that to RGB mod, so that one cable would work with all of it. So that's definitely, without a doubt, what I would suggest. And that way you just don't have to worry about resistors or capacitors or which pins you're using. You just plug it in and it works. So I'll leave links to what you need in the description. Next up, Belmont said, not really a question per se, but they're going through this weird mental journey right now with their gaming setup. They've modded every console they own for better video output and have upgraded their cables, but they're starting to come back around to the stock output of these consoles as of late. They really enjoy the process of modding the consoles, but when they want a game, they don't mind just firing up an SNES with a composite or even S-Video if they're feeling spicy. Anyone else get like this sometimes? They don't know where they were really going with this, but they wanted to share it and haven't participated in a Q&A for some time. Well, Belmont, I actually think that most people who get into this kind of fall down the same rabbit hole. And I think what a lot of people end up doing is they get all of these amazing setups and they get to use their original consoles. They love that tactile experience of the cartridge and the power button and all that stuff. And they have it through a scaler on a flat panel. But then they get that nostalgia itch and they want CRTs and they want to have the original look and feel of it. Because even with an OLED and a RetroTink 4K, it's still not ever going to be exactly the same. You get really, really close, but not exactly the same. Plus original Lightguns, all that stuff too. So what so many people end up doing is they'll end up finding a really nice CRT that only has composite or only has S-Video inputs. And then that's how they end up gaming. I've heard a lot of people have things like fully automated setups through their scaler, and then they do like a CRT on wheels, like that video that I made, and they'll wheel it over and they'll just grab their, whatever console they want to use and with some composite video cables and have like an original old school style experience that way. And depending on the mood, you might like one more than the other, but that could change on a day-to-day basis. So I think what you're going through is what most people get to at a certain point. And even people with calibrated BVMs sometimes just really appreciate the original look of composite video on a consumer CRT. I certainly do. I love seeing the differences, and it always helps me put things into perspective. And it was very easy early on to get obsessed with sharpness, clarity, and color and just forget that composite into a CRT is zero lag and perfect in every way when it comes down to gaming experience, as opposed to like now you're moving to composite on a flat panel. That's when things start to get weird, and you get a nice big beautiful flat panel and you start to really see the differences. So I totally get it. I also know people who have done things like they still want their original consoles. So they enjoy the process. They fully restore them. They do all the stuff that you see, like all the Tito videos where he pulls it apart, cleans them, recaps them, makes sure he does any preventative maintenance, cleans up the case really well. I know a lot of people who do that and get a mister. So their original console experience is there for them at any time. They have a CRT or 3. These things tend to multiply when you start collecting them. But when they just want to play a game and they don't have time to roll out the CRT, or they don't want to find a cable or whatever, they just want to plop down on their couch and play for 15 minutes because they're exhausted after a crazy day, then they fire up their Mister and everything's right there. So I've seen everything in between. I've seen people go all FPGA. I've seen people that say I will never waver from original consoles, and every happy medium combination. I'm definitely in that happy medium route. If I'm ever able to finish it, I do have a rolling cart that I want to do a video on just for fun. That's kind of in the same vein of, hey, just enjoy things how they are, when the time is right. But also, if you want to get crazy, here's all the other stuff you could do. So hopefully that helped kind of add some perspective to it. But it's always fun talking about this stuff, because with stuff like this, there's never a right answer, or there's many right answers, I guess is the better way to say it. So yeah, keep doing what you're doing, Belmont, because it sounds like as long as it's making you happy, then you're winning. Next up, Jason Guffey has a bunch of cheap RCA to BNC adapters, and occasionally a cable will slip loose off of one of those. Is it better to drop a couple $100 on really high quality ones of those adapters where the cables stay snug, or just crimp them or do any other method to keep the cables in place? So I have opinions on this. These aren't facts. So if other people have their own ideas on this, please share. But my opinion is, if you were going into an oscilloscope, there would be no doubt you go and you buy the expensive ones. They're like $4 a piece or something like that. It's ridiculous, because you don't ever want a stupid little connector to be the cause of any kind of measurement issues. And while you might have things that you don't ever notice on a TV, if the connectors aren't perfectly in place, then you might notice something weird on the scope. And especially if you wiggle the cable, then it's, what are you chasing? Are you chasing a bad connector? Are you chasing a bad cable? So if the question was in the context of using an oscilloscope or measurements, there would be no doubt you buy the expensive ones. But in the setup of it's just working, I think there's a couple of other things, like it's just working through a switch type of thing. I think there's a few other options. I personally have done things like put dabs of hot glue around it, because hot glue isn't permanent, because it'll eventually pop off. And I use that for my setups because I don't think I've ever gone 6 months without having to completely and totally gut and change my setup. So if that's you, hot glue should probably be a good idea. If you go a year or more with your setups, Shank taught me a neat trick of you basically use a soldering iron and some solder, and you just do a little bridge connection between the BNC connector and the end of your cable. And that should be fully reversible. Unlike crimping, which would potentially permanently damage both, you could just use some desoldering braid to do that. And depending on how many cables you have, like if you have a 8 in, 8 out, or a 10 in, 10 out type of thing, one line of solder should be fine. If you have like a 32 by 32, you might want to do one on each side of the cable just for some relief on that. But that should be a basically permanent solution, and you shouldn't have to worry. Of course, strain relief on the cables are important. Don't have it putting pressure, or that, I mean, that's never a good thing no matter what. But that's kind of what I would suggest for stuff like that. But I do strongly recommend that if you're doing measurements, always spend the money on the right equipment. I know you, Jason, are probably talking about just a multi-switch setup. I just want to make sure anybody listening hears that, because I've wasted hours and hours and hours of my life chasing problems that didn't exist because I had cheaper equipment, and I don't want you to waste the same amount of time that I have. But yeah, try thinking about your setup, and maybe, a hot glue just around it, maybe a half circle around the connection, or 1 or 2 things of solder to make sure that it stays bridged. But that should be all that you need, and you should save a lot of money. And the only other reason you might want to buy the expensive ones is, what if you make a ton of money and time is way more valuable to you? Then yeah, go buy the good ones. Drop your cash, plug them all in, and probably don't worry about it again. But unless you're rich with money to throw away, I would spend the extra time to just do the little bit of bodges that you need to keep them secure. Next up, your dad has a question about connecting a PVM to a PC. Your dad has a Sony 1351Q hooked up via a 5450 Radeon card using VGA to BNC cables and a BNC T adapter to combine sync. That's working perfectly for him, but I'll get to the question in a second. I just want to pause and say what you're actually doing is just essentially tying horizontal and vertical sync together and letting the PVM figure it out, which I've done that and it's definitely worked a bunch of times. However, you're sending too much voltage to the PVM. Now, most of those are built to handle it, and they say right in the spec sheet. However, double check just to make sure. And I would be much more comfortable to see you going through a passive sync combiner circuit like the one used in the HD15 discard, or using an Extron box that you could put RGB HV into it and get RGB S out. So just look into that stuff because they're not expensive and you don't want to slowly wear down your monitor faster than it should. You should be okay, but check the service manual and all the spec sheets just to make sure you could handle that high of voltage. But the question itself is, your dad has a friend that wants to do the same thing, but they don't have a PVM. They have monitors or CRTs that have component video, S video, and composite. So how would they do that with no latency? Well, first, if you're able to output direct 240p and you just need to convert that RGB HV signal to component video, you could find transcoders for that. And analog to analog transcoders are almost all zero latency added, to the point where you could even use Lightguns if you're using original consoles on them. So you will never get latency with stuff like the comp to RGB, RGB to comp, that stuff. And in fact, you could use exactly those transcoders too. You can get the RGB to comp, and then you just take the VGA output of the monitor, go through an HD15 to SCART, so that combines the sync and drops it to the safe voltage, and there's your component video output. Now, to get composite and S video, you could link transcoders together. So you could do something like, I believe, finally, after a lot of delays, the new converter from Ivory from Retro Castle should be en route to me now. Actually, I've said that before, I know, but there were a lot of delays that were not Ivory's fault. And that would allow you to just go through that same setup, 240p via the VGA output to the HD15 to SCART into this, and this will pass through RGB SCART as well as S video and composite. And you need to use the variable cap and a little screwdriver to dial in the correct composite, but that should be zero latency added as well. So those are great solutions. I don't know how much the Retro Castle one's going to be. I will test it as soon as it comes in. However, if you want just a cheap and easy solution, you could just get one of those VGA to S video or composite converters, but they're almost surely going to output via 480i. So if you wanted like a tool in your toolbox just to mess around with this stuff and see what it looks like, cool, definitely get that one and see what happens. But if you were actually looking to game on it, I would skip that altogether. I mean, since you already have a video card that does 240p, you don't need a downscaler, but depending on what you could find, there are downscalers that could do 480p to S video and composite. They're harder to find and they're not as good as the others, but that would work. So I guess you just need to figure out exactly what you're looking to do. And if it really is just 240p out of these video cards, my guess would be that a VGA cable to the HD15 to SCART, once again, assuming you're actually outputting 240p, then from that to whatever transcoder you need. You can go to component video, go to, via the RGB to comp, or you could get the other signals via the upcoming Retro Castle one. For the record too, there's other converters out there that do RGB to S video just fine, but it's the composite video that is the problem. And that's why I've been waiting on the Retro Castle one before I kind of showed that in action. So hopefully I was able to answer your question, but let me know if you have any other, if you need me to clarify anything or if there's a slightly different use case. One more from Quantum Guitar. They're looking for a way to have multiple outputs and multiple inputs at the same time. And they're talking about component video distribution amps, maybe switches that have multiple outputs. And I think in this scenario, because you're looking to mix signals, one of the things that you should look into is just a used Extron crosspoint and some adapters. It might be overkill for your solution, but it also might not be that expensive if you're going to route just a couple of component video ins, a couple of RGB ins, and then you want to just have, as you mentioned, a couple of wires to your PVM dangling just so you could plug your PVM right in. You could do this with those HD Retrovision, just RCA to RCA cables and some BNC adapters. You could just plug those right into your PVM. You could have everything wired up. And if you get an Extron crosspoint with at least 4 outputs, you could even have extras going to whatever else that you want. So you might really want to look into that. Also, the upcoming switch from Arthremis that should be around next month, one way or the other, would handle all of this stuff for you. And I don't know if there's any word on price yet, but if you were looking for something brand new that already had the exact connections that you're looking for, because you could mix and match which modules go into each, then that would definitely be the one I would recommend. So I would kind of just take a step back and see what your total solution would be. Would having multiple matrix switch options like an Extron crosspoint could provide be the best option? Or do you really need a bunch of mixed inputs and a couple of different outputs? Totally up to you to decide, but that would definitely make this question easier to answer. Also, Quantum Guitar wanted to know if I had any recommendations for N64 and SNES controller extension cables. All the ones I buy are from console5.com. They stock what's available. Sometimes they're not great because there are no good options available. I think Sega Saturn controller extensions were pretty terrible for a while, but the SNES ones I bought were pretty good. So I would start with them and see where you go. But if anybody has any other suggestions, please let us know in the comments, because I'd really be curious if there's a new type out there that's known to be good or whatever. Well, that's it for this week. This one was recorded over multiple hours because I started recording and my internet connection died, and I spent an hour on the phone waiting to talk to somebody just to have it come back on and have them say it was an outage, even though their automatic service said there were no outages in my area. And then I got a big delivery where I had to move stuff around. So if I look different, or if it's if the lighting's wildly different, that's why, because I started these early in the morning and ended these a lot later than I thought. But anyway, as always, thanks so much to everybody who participates in these. And if you want to ask any question at all, just please ask it wherever it is that you support in the latest Q&A post. The way the services work, it's kind of hard to figure out what's a new question on an old post. Plus, as you saw today, I just go through the different services and then answer these questions as if I was hanging out with you in person somewhere. So thank you very much, and I will see you all next week.